From the Central Western Washington area, Choice Regional Health Network presents the Equity Circle podcast, a place for information with integrity, accountability, and innovation. Enjoy the episode. All right, everyone. Welcome to the Equity Circle podcast. My name is Lawrence Kinnaman. I'm very excited to be here with a colleague of mine, Zach Lynch. Welcome to the podcast, man.
Thank you so much for having me, Lawrence.
Oh, of course, man. I look forward to the conversation that we're going to have today. So for those that may not have had a chance to listen to last week's episode, we have started a new mini series about how to be safe tips for the holidays. And so we're going to be doing something a little bit different when it comes to that today, but we're excited to have part 2 of that episode. So before we get into that, though, Zach, would love if you could just introduce yourself. Tell us a little about yourself professionally, what you do for Choice, and then something about yourself personally as well.
Cool. So I am the Substance Use and Prevention Program Manager at Choice and CPAA. So myself, along with my team members, Marissa and Jennifer, we implement and oversee the opioid response programming for the MTP project, for our regional youth marijuana prevention programming, and 2 federal HRSA grants for opioid response. So I have a background in working with youth for in direct service, providing substance use counseling in a co-occurring disorder inpatient treatment facility in King County. And since that point, I've been hard at work trying to enhance my systems perspectives to do systems level work. So I have an MSW, an MPA, and I have just applied to MPH programs because things are not very good and I want them to be better.
Yeah.
That's the gist.
Fair enough. So what about yourself personally?
I grew up in Olympia. I lived in Seattle for about 8 years, and I just moved back to Olympia for the pandemic. So very
perfect timing.
Well, it was not a coincidence. And also it was not a good time to be graduating a social work school without a job. So
yeah.
But I have family that I live with in Olympia. I hang out with I keep a lot of pets. Those are ways that I've stayed sane over the past 2 years now, in addition to just filling up my calendar with school and work. So I don't have a whole lot of personal things to share, that's kind of what it's been for the last several years.
Well, it has been a pretty crazy last couple of years. And I know just having a pet, especially during this time, is always nice to have. We have a dog at our house, so we always appreciate it. Well, it's good to have you on. It's good to hear more about you, Zach. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about there's often many songs that talk about how this time of the year is the most wonderful time of the year, right? And for some it is. I know there's certain things that people do really enjoy about this time of the year. But for others, it can be challenging. It can be stressful. It can be lonely, especially for those that you work on behalf of and with, Zach. It seems that this time of the year, especially for those in recovery, it can be really challenging. And so, what are some safe tips or things that people can know, especially as we meet with family and these issues do unfortunately hit our families as well, and they can be near and dear to some people's hearts, but it could also be with those that are experiencing houselessness and others that we see. So can you just talk about some of the ways that we can be mindful of them during the season?
Yeah, I'll start with just sort of going over some of the risks as to why that maybe makes this a time that's not the most wonderful time of the year for some folks, probably more than we would maybe assume at face value. statistically speaking.
Yeah.
But I'll say that depending on your situation during the holidays. I mean, it could be some of the risk factors could be isolation. They could be stress, just because there's a lot happening. Um, and relatedly, there could be abrupt changes to someone's routine due to just the volume of things that are going on, and the you know big last minute changes, or parties or whatever. Um, and that routine might be critical to someone's recovery strategy. Um, or the potential for conflict. Spending time with family is not as enticing or safe for everyone as it might be
Mm.
for others. So those are some of the challenges that might be laid out or exacerbated during this time.
Yeah.
Um, but then taking a closer look at maybe how we could go into this prepared, to avoid the fallout or the severity of some of these potential the consequences of these risk factors. So
Yeah.
depending on one situation, if the stressors are that there's too much going on, or if there's too little going on, right? And isolation or boredom or loneliness are coming up. Maybe there are two different kinds of strategies that someone
Yeah.
could take to that, but there's some overlap. So just if there's too much going on, um, I would I would say that having contingency plans and relying on relapse prevention work,
Mm.
refusal skills, and coping skills or coping strategies.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
just just knowing that these things are coming, and having a plan, right? That's not foolproof. There's nothing that's going to be foolproof
Sure.
during the holidays or in recovery. But
Yeah. Yeah.
just and I'll get into some of the finer details to some of these things, as I as I ramble on. But the just knowing that you're going to you know potentially come into conflict with folks, that emotions might be high for one reason or another, right? All these things can be uh, triggering or risks, depending on someone's background and the reasoning, their experiences that have contributed to their use. So planning things out, um, and knowing maybe some exit strategies, or some
Mm.
how to calm yourself down,
Yeah.
how to maybe remove yourself temporarily from a situation, going into something that will be overstimulating or overly stressful, um, would be some sorts of general suggestions um, I would
Yeah.
maybe make. And then on the opposite side of things, looking at isolation, um, I think the most important thing to say, is that as cliched as it might be, you're not alone. You're very much not alone. Right?
Yeah.
This is a very statistically significant. There is mathematical evidence to show that you are definitely not alone.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this time of year is really difficult, one way or the other, for a lot of folks.
Mm.
And some of the suggestions, though, might be similar in that creating structure during this time, if you have too much time, um, so to speak, uh, and setting goals for yourself, being really kind to yourself and investing in yourself, um, or reflecting, depending on what the rest of your year looks like, right? Maybe you do really need a break from something.
Yeah.
um, maybe you don't. Just creating structure in the same way as having a plan and setting goals going into maybe a more stressful, a more stimulating experience. Some
Sure.
of the suggestions may be the same. um, and then returning to noting that folks aren't alone, right? There may very well be, depending on where you are, a handful of community events, right? um, handful of community events for folks in recovery, maybe for the holidays. It really depends. Maybe there's not. Um, and so exhausting those resources is something definitely to be aware of. But also, that's not to say that maybe someone has an ongoing struggle with isolation and depression, in which case, making sure that you reach out to people, right, is not a good suggestion. And just like, the suggestion coming is like, oh, well, you have a problem. Well, what if you decided not to have that problem anymore, right? And you just went out and talked to people, right? So to those ends, right, depending on why someone might be using, that might be a really not a helpful suggestion, to which I would maybe return to, structure and setting goals, being kind to yourself, and maybe really selectively seeking folks who really can relate to you, or going to a space where you can meet someone who has a much more refined lens to look at your experiences and align with what you're going through. So you're definitely not alone in that either. So yeah, those are the preliminary thoughts that I had when Lawrence gave me my homework assignment to prepare for this podcast.
Well, I appreciate it, and just kind of summarize some of the things that you said, Zach, is really just, it sounds like if you're on either side of the spectrum, if you are looking to have a lot more time on your hands or less time in your hands, and there's a lot going on, it sounds like the idea, it's simple but hard to do sometimes in practice, is to have a plan, and to be able to recognize some of the triggers or things that are happening in you, and also in the people maybe that that are going through this and are in recovery, and knowing that the holidays are a tough time for them. So it kind of sounds like on both ends there is this idea of having a plan, but also having appreciated the words that you used of being kind to yourself, and kind of embracing that compassion for yourself and for other people as they work through this, instead of maybe ignorance or things like you were saying, well, maybe you should just not do that anymore, and not necessarily understanding the deeper levels of what's going on there. Is that kind of fair of some of the things that you've shared?
Yeah. And hearing that reflected back to me, I just would want to make extra clear that when it comes to having a plan, like I said, one of the risk factors can be abrupt changes, right? Because things happen in high volume and at high speeds over the holidays. So, I mean, we can't plan for everything, right? So that's where the contingencies and just the skills, right? Like really, really looking back on the skills, the recovery skills that folks have built up to this point, or maybe even in people supporting other people in recovery skills, like taking a look at that, and what kinds of scenarios you might be faced with, which I guess ultimately is still returning to have a plan, but it's a plan for adapting to when you can't have a plan, if that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense.
Just being prepared, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Being flexible. I think I would argue that we're all in recovery in one sense or another, but for those that maybe are specifically in the recovery that we're referring to, I guess in this podcast today, is that there is a need to be flexible, but I think that's for everyone, right? I guess it's kind of why I brought that up, the idea of everyone being in recovery. Like, we're all recovering from something, but specifically to this conversation, having that flexibility is so key, and it's hard to do, honestly, because there is so much that goes on during this time of the year.
Yeah, just being prepared to support yourself and know yourself, and know the other people and things going on in your life. Yeah, I did have one other idea that I wanted to visit, if that's all right with you.
Absolutely.
Okay. I just wanted to highlight, in terms of shifting gears from speaking maybe directly to folks who are in recovery, looking towards people who are supporting people who are in recovery, or maybe not knowing that that's the role that they play in someone's life, at hosting events and hosting parties over the holidays. Just that there's a really different social narrative and social rules that apply to alcohol, compared to other things that folks might use, and just knowing that it's a lot more socially acceptable to pressure your friends and family
Sure.
into consuming alcohol, despite the fact that that there has a really without hosting an entirely different podcast episode, right? There are totally different narratives attached to it, and it's
Yeah.
much more socially acceptable to just really try and push it on folks, despite the
Sure.
fact that it's ultimately a very dangerous substance.
Yeah.
But just knowing that when you're creating a space to host people or to entertain people during this time, knowing, or being mindful of the fact that or being mindful of whether or not you're creating a space that's welcoming to folks in recovery,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
Or not necessarily only focusing on whether or not you're doing that, but just like knowing how to support people if they are hesitant to, or just not wanting to be around alcohol use, right? There's a number
Sure.
of things that you can do, right? I mean, the event can be not centered around drinking, which might seem like something that is a message that's geared towards younger people or college students, but it's not. This is a targeted message towards folks of all ages. But not pressuring people, maybe obviously maybe not definitely taking no for an answer and hearing folks
Sure.
and what
Sure.
they're trying to tell you, and also being aware of risks for overdose. So we talked of kind of risks for relapse before, but this also could be its own podcast episode. But just knowing that the location in which you are drinking, the dosing, and how folks' tolerance may have changed over time if they have been intentionally not using or unintentionally not using, just like it changes in the same way that
Right.
someone's tolerance for opioids does.
Mm.
So just making sure that people are safe, the people who are drinking and the people who are not. There's a lot to consider. So just being really making sure that you're really listening to and soliciting input from people. It can definitely be done without taking up applying a particularly pointed or big lens, right? It can be absorbed
Right.
into your regular event planning procedures and policies and procedures. So that's just in terms of not just in folks engaging with the holiday period, but also there are there can be more of a risk than people realize, and I just
Sure.
wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's just this idea of kind of not only thinking about yourself but thinking about others, right? And trying to find ways to be considerate, and we've kind of talked about compassion a little bit, and being willing to maybe put away things that you have done previously to make sure that someone else succeeds, and like someone else is able to get through the holidays in a safe way. So that's kind of the hope. And Zach, as we kind of come to a close today, I would love if you could just kind of share what sort of other tips, final things you want to share as we come to a close today.
Yeah, I think I'll just kind of refine another one of my points as it's been again reflected back to me by you. Building from that, you really don't want to, if it's hard for someone to kind of push back on on sort of the standard operating procedures of holiday events and general non part of the calendar specific shenanigans. If it's hard, right? If it's kind of a new thing for your relationship with someone, you really don't want to put that at risk by like them trying to communicate something to you, and it really being something that is a minimal lift on your end, and then showing them that you don't have the capacity to take into account what they're saying to you or listening to what they're saying. It's so that's kind of why I wanted to stress having just kind of knowing what to look for, right, to folks who are maybe supporting
Right.
folks in recovery. Just like
Yeah.
if someone is pushing back really gently, asking a follow-up question might be a good idea, or just listening to what you've been given, right? Because it's not always easy to, it's generally not easy to push back, and maybe that's not the right way to frame it. Just to voice your needs in a space where maybe you are doing things differently than your friends or your family, right? You're
Sure.
having trouble, in some cases maybe standing up to the way that things are done. I mean, maybe not. Maybe that's not the relationship, but it could be, right? So just
Right.
just
Right.
just be careful. Just listen to people. just be kind to yourself and to the other important people that you're inviting to your holiday parties.
Well, Zach, I really appreciated just getting to hear your perspective, and hopefully it was helpful for our listeners as we come into the holidays, knowing that it's, because we kind of said in the beginning of this episode that it's not always the most wonderful time of the year for those for everyone really, but especially could be for people in recovery as well. That this could be a really tough time. So I really want to thank you for being on the podcast today and for sharing your thoughts. It's been really helpful.
Thank you. Thanks for creating a platform for these thoughts to be voiced.
Absolutely. Well, you have been listening to Zach Lynch from Choice Regional Health Network. I want to thank you, listeners, for listening to another episode of the Equity Circle podcast. You can find us on all major platforms wherever you listen to podcasts. Please share with friends and family and leave us a good review. And lastly, remember that equity equals progress.